There is a city that has carried the weight of the world on its stones for thousands of years, a city where prophets have wept in its streets, where kings have built their thrones upon its hills, where the smoke of ancient offerings once curled upward into a sky that felt close enough to touch. Jerusalem. Even the name carries something, a gravity, a sense that when you speak it, you are touching something older than memory itself. Tonight we return to that city. We return to a particular afternoon during a particular feast, when the streets were thick with pilgrims, and the air smelled of dust and lamb, and the faint sweetness of cedar wood. We return to a story that begins not in a palace, not in a place of power, but beside a pool of still water surrounded by the people the world had given up on. This is the story of a man who waited 38 years. It is the story of a question that cut through every excuse he had ever prepared. And it is the story of three words spoken to a body that had forgotten how to obey. Let us go there now. Let us walk the old stones of Jerusalem together in the fading warmth of a festival afternoon and find the pool called Bethesda and the man who had made it his entire world. The great feasts of Israel were unlike anything in the ancient world. Scholars and historians have tried for centuries to capture in language what it meant for the Jewish people to converge upon Jerusalem at appointed times. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Weeks. These were not merely religious observances in the modern sense of the word. They were national migrations. They were communal acts of memory. When the feast days approached, families who had lived scattered across Judea, Galilee, the Decapolis, and the regions beyond would pack what they could carry and begin walking. Some came from days away. Some had traveled their entire lives to stand inside the temple courts at least once before they died. The roads leading to Jerusalem during festival season would be thick with caravans, with laughter, with the sound of children running ahead of their parents through the dust, with the low conversation of old men who had made this walk before and knew every stone along the way. The city itself transformed during the feasts. The population swelled beyond what its walls were built to hold. Every courtyard became a guest chamber. Every rooftop hosted sleeping travelers beneath the open stars. The markets ran from before dawn until the last lamp burned out. The temple, that enormous, gleaming complex of white stone and gold leaf that sat upon the elevated platform of Mount Moriah, became the center of everything. The sound of the shofar echoed across the surrounding hills. The smell of sacrifice drifted over the city like something ancient and unrelenting. And yet within that vast and beautiful complexity, there were corners of Jerusalem that the festival season did not transform into something bright. There were places where the joy of the gathered crowds did not quite reach. Places where the sick and the abandoned waited in a silence that the trumpet blast could not fill. One of those places was just inside the city walls near what was known as the Sheep Gate, and the gate through which animals were brought into the city for use in temple sacrifices. It was not a glamorous location. The northern edge of the Temple Mount was a place of practical business, of commerce, of the daily grinding work of religious obligation. And near this gate, there was a pool with 5 covered colonnades, 5 roofed porches that stretched around its edges, providing shade and shelter from the sun and the occasional rain. The pool was called Bethesda, which in Aramaic carried a meaning that felt almost too perfect for the place. Some scholars translate it as House of Mercy, others as House of Outpouring. Either translation fits because what gathered beneath those 5 porticos was a population that had come in search of exactly those things: mercy and outpouring, something from somewhere that could do what no physician, no family member, no amount of praying alone at night had managed to accomplish. Beneath the covered colonnades of Bethesda lay the blind, their eyes sealed shut by cataracts or disease, or the accidents of a world that did not always protect the fragile. They sat with their hands open in their laps, navigating the world entirely by sound. The slap of sandals on the wet stone, the conversation of strangers, the distant trumpet calls from the temple that told them what hour of the day it was. There were the lame, people whose legs had failed them through injury or illness, or the slow collapse of bones that had simply decided they would carry the weight no further. Some had crutches fashioned from branches. Some had learned to drag themselves along the stone floors with their arms. Some were carried by family members who came each morning and returned each evening, and had organized their entire lives around the logistics of that journey. And there were those the ancient texts described simply as paralyzed, people for whom whole sections of their bodies had gone silent, unresponsive, as though the connection between thought and motion had simply been cut, and no one had found a way to restore it. They waited beneath those 5 porticos because of a belief, a tradition, perhaps ancient, perhaps newer than it sounded, but deeply held, that on certain unpredictable occasions an angel would descend and stir the waters of the pool. And when the waters moved, the first person who managed to enter the pool would be healed. Whatever their affliction was, whatever had brought them to this place of last resort, it would be undone by those stirred waters. Think about what that means. Think about what that tradition did to the people gathered there. It created a community organized entirely around a moment of uncertain timing. No one knew when the waters would move. No one could predict which morning or which afternoon the surface of that pool would suddenly begin to ripple from somewhere beneath. So they stayed. They waited day after day, season after season, some of them for years, always watching the surface of the water, always listening for the murmur that would signal it was happening, always bracing to move as fast as their broken bodies could manage toward the edge. And therein lay the particular cruelty of the arrangement for so many of them. The healing, if it came, went to the first person who reached the water. The sick competed against each other. The man with no use of his legs watched men who were merely blind scramble past him. The woman whose paralysis allowed her to move one arm watched others drag themselves forward on two. The race to healing was rigged against the most severely afflicted. The ones who needed the water most were, by the nature of their need, the least likely to reach it first. It was a place of extraordinary hope and extraordinary heartbreak, existing in the same square footage of stone and water and shade. A place where mercy was promised, but access to it was governed by a rule that rewarded the least sick, where the presence of healing made the waiting more acute, not less. Because at Bethesda, you were never simply in despair. You were always in despair while hope was just across the courtyard, shimmering on the surface of that pool. Among the many bodies lying beneath those covered colonnades, there was one man. The Gospel of John does not give us his name, and this omission feels significant, not careless, but intentional. He is not named because he is, in some sense, meant to stand for something larger than a single biography. He is the man, the one whose story the text has chosen to follow through this particular afternoon. And the detail that John's Gospel offers about him first is not the nature of his condition, but its duration. He had been ill for 38 years. 38 years. Say that slowly. Let it rest in the mind for a moment. 38 years is not a stretch of time that fits neatly into the imagination. It is the length of a career. It is the span from birth to the edge of middle age. It is long enough to watch children grow into adults, to watch parents grow old and die, to watch fashions change and political regimes shift, and the faces in the marketplace turn over entirely, twice, perhaps 3 times. 38 years is long enough that the life you were living before the affliction began starts to feel like something that happened to a different person. The memory of walking, of moving without effort, of simply rising from a sleeping mat and standing upright and going wherever your feet chose to take you. After 38 years, that memory has become almost mythological, something from before the world was this way. We do not know how this man came to be at the pool of Bethesda. We do not know if he arrived a month after his illness began, full of desperate hope, or if he spent decades searching elsewhere first and arrived at the pool only when every other option had been exhausted. We do not know if he had family, people who brought him food and water, and news of the outside world, or whether he had been abandoned to the routine charity of strangers. We do not know if he had ever been close to healing, had ever felt himself poised at the edge of a stirred pool with a clear path forward, only to be outpaced at the last moment. The text does not tell us these things. What the text tells us is this: he was there. He had been there long enough that Jesus, who had apparently been watching this man, or who knew this man's situation through means the gospel does not pause to explain, knew about the 38 years. And the text tells us one other thing. Jesus asked him a question before doing anything else. To picture the afternoon, the festival crowds moving through the streets just beyond the walls of this place, the sound of the city drifting in over the colonnades, voices calling out, the distant lowing of animals, the sandaled footsteps of 10,000 pilgrims. And here inside the pool complex, the familiar low atmosphere of the chronically ill. People lying on their mats, adjusting their positions against the discomfort of the stone, dozing in the warmth, watching each other with the dull familiarity of long acquaintance. The pool itself sitting in the center, its surface still and dark in the shade of the afternoon. Jesus moves through this space. John's gospel tells us, with striking matter-of-factness, that Jesus saw this man lying there and knew he had been in this condition for a long time. What is remarkable about that sentence is what it implies. There were many people at Bethesda that day, many blind, many lame, many paralyzed. The full range of human bodily failure was present beneath those porticos, and Jesus knew this. He saw all of it, but his attention came to rest on this particular man. Not because this man was the loudest or the most dramatic in his suffering, or because he had found some way to attract attention. The text gives no indication that this man had singled himself out in any way. Jesus simply saw him, simply turned his attention in a crowd of suffering to one face, one body, one 38-year history. There is something here that deserves to be held carefully because it speaks to something the rest of the story will only deepen. The Pool of Bethesda was a place where healing was structured as a competition where the measure of who received it first was speed, physical capability, proximity to the edge. Jesus enters this space and immediately reverses the logic. He does not go to whoever is closest to the water. He does not seek out the person most likely to reach the pool. He seeks out the one who has been there the longest, the one who has demonstrably, repeatedly failed to win the race that the pool requires, the one who, by the pool's own rules, should be last. And then he asks the question, do you want to be made well? It is easy at first glance to read that question as strange, even slightly cruel. Of course the man wants to be made well. He has been lying beside a healing pool for some portion of 38 years. Why would Jesus need to ask? What is the point of the question? But the more you sit with it, the more the question opens up. Because what Jesus is asking is not quite as simple as whether the man wants his legs to work. He is asking something that cuts beneath the surface of physical desire into something older and murkier, something that long suffering does to a person's inner architecture. to the way they understand themselves in the world and what is possible within it. 38 years of disability is 38 years of building a life around a limitation, a life in which the limitation is not the exception, but the foundation. You learn over that span of time not just how to manage your condition, but how to think of yourself in relation to it. Your identity becomes inseparable from what you cannot do. Your days are structured around what your body will not allow. Your relationships, your expectations, your private interior conversations about the future, all of it is shaped by the fact of the limitation. The limitation is not something that happened to you and then stood apart from you. After 38 years, the limitation is you in some very real psychological sense. And so when someone appears and asks, not how you are managing, not what you need today, not whether you've eaten or whether your mat is dry, but do you want to be made well? They are asking something more destabilizing than it sounds. They are asking whether you are prepared for the life that would exist on the other side of what you have always known. Whether you want not just the healing, but everything healing would unmake about the self you have built inside this limitation. There is also the matter of disappointment. 38 years beside a pool that has never moved for you, or if it has never moved in your direction, has never resulted in you being the one who made it to the edge in time, is 38 years of daily hope followed by daily failure. The kind of repeated disappointment that does not simply accumulate, but compounds, each new day adding its weight to the structure of all previous days until the structure becomes something you live inside rather than something you carry. Hope after that many years can become genuinely dangerous. To hope again, really hope, the kind of open and unprotected hope that vulnerability requires, is to risk adding one more layer to a structure that is already almost too heavy to bear. Jesus, who appears throughout the Gospels to understand the inner life of the people he encounters with an accuracy that goes far beyond ordinary perception, asks this question not because he does not know the answer, but because the answer matters. Because the act of saying it, of speaking it aloud, of bringing it up from wherever it has been buried under 38 years of waiting, is itself part of what needs to happen before anything else can. And the man answers not with a simple yes, not with weeping or desperation or some dramatic declaration of faith. He answers the way someone answers when they have explained this particular situation many times before and have long since abandoned any expectation that explaining it will change anything. He says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." This is a profoundly human answer. It is not an answer to the question that was asked. Jesus asked if he wanted to be made well. The man answers by describing the logistical problem that has prevented him from reaching the water. It is the answer of someone who has spent so much time thinking about the mechanism of potential healing, the pool, the timing, the scramble to the edge, that the deeper question has become almost impossible to hear. It is the answer of someone who has perhaps stopped thinking about wellness itself and started thinking only about the race, about whether this time someone will help him, whether this time he will be fast enough. The question of whether he wants to be well has dissolved into the question of how one gets into the pool. But also, and this is important, it is an honest answer. It is not a performance of faith. It is not a dramatic declaration. It is a tired man telling the truth about a situation. The pool has not worked for him, not because of a lack of desire, but because of a lack of help. Someone always gets there first. He is not bitter exactly. He is simply describing what has been true every day for as long as he can remember. And it is to this tired, honest, logistically focused man that Jesus speaks the words that change everything. There are moments in Scripture that require very little ornamentation to be felt. Moments where the text is so clean, so spare, so precisely arranged that the addition of anything would only dilute what is already there. This is one of those moments. Jesus does not offer a lengthy discourse. He does not explain what he is about to do or why. He does not ask the man to describe his faith or recount his prayer history or demonstrate his worthiness in any way. He speaks three words, or in the Greek of John's Gospel, a single sentence with three distinct commands, and they are simply this: get up, pick up your mat, walk. There is no conditional language here. No if you believe, or if you are worthy, or if the pool's waters are right. There is only the command, the statement of what is now required, spoken as though the body has already caught up with the instruction. Get up, which presumes that getting up is now possible. Pick up your mat, which presumes not only that he can stand, but that he can bend, can grasp, can lift, that the full range of ordinary human motion has been restored. Walk, the simplest and most extraordinary of the three. Walk as though he has simply been sitting still for a moment and has now been reminded to move on. And the man does. The text says it with the same spare elegance as the command itself. Immediately the man was made well, and he took up his mat and walked. Immediately, not after a moment of trembling, not after a gradual return of sensation, a slow rebuilding of strength, a tentative first attempt followed by collapse, followed by another attempt. Immediately, the 38 years ended in a single breath. Whatever had held his body in that state of paralysis, whatever disruption to nerve or muscle or bone, or all three, had kept him lying on that mat beside that pool through decade after decade, it was gone. Simply gone. Replaced by a wholeness that was, in one sense, entirely new to this man, and in another sense, in the most ancient and natural thing about him, the ordinary functioning of a human body moving through the world as it was meant to move. Picture what happens in that body in the moments after the command is spoken. Sensation returning to limbs that have been silent for decades. Not pain exactly, but the sudden, overwhelming awareness of having limbs, having legs, having feet, having the whole complex, living architecture of a body that works. The feeling of the stone floor under those feet as he stands, really stands. Full weight, full balance, the automatic adjustments of muscles and tendons, and the inner ear that allow a standing person to remain upright without thinking about it. The man has not thought about any of these things in 38 years because he has not needed to. And now suddenly, all of it is operating not as something remarkable, not as something he has to concentrate on maintaining, but simply as the baseline condition of being alive in a body that functions. He bends down and rolls up his mat. That gesture alone, bending, reaching, grasping, standing again, contains 38 years of impossibility made suddenly ordinary. And then he walks, out from under the portico, past the other people lying on their mats, past the pool whose waters never stirred for him, past the columns of stone that had framed his existence for what might have been years, and out into whatever comes next. The text of John's Gospel tells us something else about that day, and it is the kind of detail that would almost be ironic if it were not so revealing of human nature. It was the Sabbath, the Sabbath, the seventh day, and the day of rest commanded in the book of Genesis and elaborated through centuries of rabbinic tradition into an extraordinarily detailed system of prohibitions and permissions. By the time of Jesus, the oral tradition around Sabbath observance had grown into a complex and carefully maintained structure. The rabbis had identified 39 categories of forbidden labor, and carrying objects from one domain to another was among them. Carrying a burden on the Sabbath, it was prohibited, and a sleeping mat, the mat the man had just rolled up and tucked under his arm, the mat he was now carrying through the streets of Jerusalem, qualified as a burden. So when the religious authorities encountered this man walking with his mat, their first question was not about him, not about how he was, not about the extraordinary thing that had happened to a body that had not worked for 38 years, not about the nature of the healing or who had performed it or what it meant. Their first question was about the mat. "It is the Sabbath," they told him. "It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." The man's response is simple and direct. He says, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" He is not arguing theology. He is stating the chain of causation as he experienced it. Someone healed me. That same someone told me to carry my mat. I carried it. He is not trying to pick a fight about religious law. He is not, at this moment, even thinking about religious law. He is a man who walked out of 38 years of paralysis an hour ago. The categories of his mind are still trying to catch up with the reality of his body, but the authorities are not satisfied. They want to know who told him to do this, who is responsible. The text says the healed man did not know who it was, that Jesus had withdrawn into the crowd that filled the area. In the chaos of a festival day, in a city full of pilgrims, Jesus had simply become one face among thousands. Think about that. The man who had just been healed of a 38-year affliction could not have pointed to his healer and said, "That is him. That is the man." He had been lying on his mat. He had heard a voice, received a command, felt his body respond, and then presumably he had been so absorbed in the process of standing and rolling his mat and walking for the first time in decades that by the time he looked up, the crowd had closed around whoever had spoken to him. He did not even know the name. This will matter, because later Jesus finds him again. The temple courts were the heart of Jerusalem during the feast days. The enormous platform of the Temple Mount, an engineering achievement that remains astonishing even by modern standards. A massive artificial platform constructed to elevate the temple complex above the surrounding city was filled during the feast with worshipers, with teachers and their students, with merchants operating in the outer courts, with the ceaseless movement of a people engaged in the great annual act of appearing before their God. It was into this space that the healed man eventually came, perhaps to give thanks, perhaps simply because the temple was where a Jewish man went on a feast day, and he was, for the first time in 38 years, a man who could walk to the temple under his own power. And there, Jesus found him. The text does not tell us how. In a crowd of thousands on the most active day of the religious calendar, Jesus located this man in the temple courts, and when he found him, he spoke to him again. And what he said this second time is almost as striking as what he said the first time. "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, so that nothing worse may happen to you." This is a statement that has generated considerable theological discussion over the centuries, because it touches on the ancient and often debated question of the relationship between sin and suffering. The disciples of Jesus, earlier in John's Gospel, will ask him point blank about a man born blind. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The assumption embedded in that question, that suffering is a consequence of sin, that physical affliction tracks moral failure, was not an obscure fringe belief. It was a common framework for understanding why bad things happen to people, a framework with deep roots in certain interpretations of the Hebrew Scriptures and in the surrounding culture. If you suffered, something had gone wrong morally. Either you had sinned or someone close to you had. Suffering was, in this view, a kind of ledger entry, evidence that some account somewhere had gone into debt. Jesus, in the case of the blind man, explicitly rejects this framework. He tells the disciples that neither the man nor his parents sinned, that the man was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. The suffering was not the consequence of sin. It was the context for something else entirely. But here, at the temple, Jesus says something different. Sin no more, so that nothing worse may happen to you. He does not say that the 38-year illness was caused by sin. He does not make that causal claim. What he says is forward-looking. It is a warning, a pastoral instruction, a word of concern for what comes next. Whatever the man's history, whatever the relationship between the life he had lived and the condition that had kept him beside that pool, Jesus is not here to prosecute the past. He is here to speak to the future. You have been made well. Now live in accordance with that wholeness. Protect what has been given to you. It is the word of someone who takes seriously both the gift that has just been given and the person who has received it. It is not a threat. It is not a condition. Your healing will be revoked if you sin. It is a charge, a recognition that the healed man now has a future he did not have this morning, and that the question of how he inhabits that future matters. The healed man, upon learning the name of his healer, upon learning that it was Jesus who had spoken to him at the pool, Jesus who had told him to get up and walk, goes to the religious authorities and tells them. The text reports this without editorial comment. We do not know the man's motivation. Was he grateful and thought they should know? Was he afraid of the authorities and tried to deflect their suspicion by naming the one responsible? Did he not fully understand the implications of what he was saying? Did he not realize that naming Jesus to the religious leadership of Jerusalem was not a neutral act? The text does not say, it simply says he told them it was Jesus who had made him well. And the authorities, for their part, used this information not as an occasion for wonder, but as an occasion for opposition. This is the moment in John's Gospel where the conflict between Jesus and the religious establishment of Jerusalem hardens from friction into something more determined. The text says that the Jewish leaders began persecuting Jesus because he had done this on the Sabbath. And when Jesus, confronted with their opposition, speaks about his relationship with God, about the Son doing what the Father does, about the Father having given all judgment to the Son, the opposition sharpens further. They wanted to kill him, the text says, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. A healing, a single act of restoration beside a pool of still water. A man who had not walked in 38 years, walking, and within hours the news of it has traveled through the city and landed in the laps of men who have decided that the most important thing about this event is that it happened on the wrong day, that the mat the man carried was a violation, that the one who healed him had stepped outside the boundaries of what the law permitted, that the correct response to the extraordinary is not wonder, but interrogation, and the correct conclusion is not gratitude, but prosecution. This is not unique to the first century. It is perhaps one of the most consistent and sobering features of institutional religious life in every era. The tendency of systems built to protect the sacred to become, over time, better at protecting themselves than at protecting the sacred. The rules that were meant to honor God become, by degrees, rules that honor the rule. The traditions that were meant to create space for the holy become, by degrees, traditions that crowd it out. The Sabbath was given to Israel as a gift, as a weekly reminder that human beings are not defined by their labor, that rest is holy, that the rhythm of creation includes cessation. And somehow, by the time Jesus walked through the pool of Bethesda, the gift had become a fence, and the fence had become a wall. And on one particular afternoon, a man stood up from a 38-year paralysis and carried his mat through the streets of Jerusalem, and the wall was offended. Let us stay for a moment with the question that Jesus asked, because it is worth asking again here, in the quietness of this evening, in whatever room you are in right now, with whatever you have been carrying. Do you want to be made well? It is a question that sounds simple and is not. It is a question that assumes that the person being asked has a genuine say in the matter. That wellness is not just something that happens to you or fails to happen to you, but something that requires a kind of interior consent, a willingness to participate, a readiness to receive what healing would require of you, and what it would cost you, and what it would change. The man at Bethesda had, in some sense, I'd organized his entire life around the idea of getting into the pool. The pool was his answer. The pool was where healing lived. And when Jesus appeared, he did not bring the pool. He brought something that had nothing to do with the pool. He bypassed the entire system the man had been waiting in for decades and spoke directly to the condition itself. Get up, pick up your mat, walk. This is worth noticing. The man's answer to Jesus had been entirely about the pool, about the logistics of accessing the healing that the pool represented. And Jesus did not argue with him about the pool, did not say the pool is the wrong answer, did not dismiss the tradition or the belief or the years the man had invested in that particular form of hope. He simply ignored the pool, went around it, spoke to the body directly, as though the body had been waiting for exactly this kind of speech. Specific, clear, confident, expecting a response. How many of us have spent years of our lives focused on a particular pool? On one specific source from which we have decided that what we need most must come, and have found ourselves season after season unable to get there in time, watching others reach it first, explaining to anyone who will listen the logistical problem that keeps us from the edge of the water. The pool is not always a physical place. Sometimes the pool is a relationship we think will finally make us whole. Sometimes it is a professional achievement. Sometimes it is a particular financial threshold. Sometimes it is the approval of someone whose approval we have spent years trying to earn. The pool is wherever we have decided that the thing we need most is located, and to which we have turned our lives into a waiting room. And the question Jesus asks is, do you want to be made well? Not, do you want to get to the pool? Do you want to be made well? It is a question about the destination, not the route. A question about what lies on the other side of all the waiting. And implicit in the question is a possibility that the pool cannot offer. That healing might be available through a means that has nothing to do with the logistics of your particular situation. That it might come not from the water being stirred at the right moment, when you happen to be close enough, but from a voice speaking directly to what is broken in you, without waiting for any conditions to be met. There is something else in this story that tends to be overlooked, and it is the matter of what Jesus asked the man to do in order to be healed. He asked him to do the very thing that his illness prevented him from doing. Get up. This is not possible for a paralyzed man. The paralysis is precisely the inability to get up. To command a paralyzed man to get up is to ask for the impossible, or at least it would be if the command were coming from any other source. Jesus tells a man who cannot stand to stand. He tells a man who cannot lift to lift. He tells a man who cannot walk to walk. The commands are not instructions for how to access healing. They are instructions that the healing makes possible. And the only way to know if the healing has occurred is to attempt the commands before certainty is available. This is the structure of faith as it appears throughout the Gospels, and it is not a comfortable structure. It does not say, first believe fully, then act. It says, act in the direction of what you have been promised, and discover in the acting whether the promise holds. The man could not have known before he tried to get up that his legs would support him. He had to try first. He had to commit, at least fractionally, to the motion, to shift his weight in the direction of standing, to engage muscles that had been silent for 38 years. And in that moment of attempted obedience, the healing met him. This is a pattern that appears again and again in the miracle stories of the New Testament. The 10 lepers are told to go and show themselves to the priests, the act required of a cleansed person, and as they go, before they have arrived, they are cleansed. The disciples are told to launch their boats and let down their nets after a night of catching nothing. And the choice to obey, despite the apparent absurdity of the instruction, is what precedes the catch. The blind man in John 9 is told to go wash in the pool of Siloam, a walk he has to make blind. And he goes, and he washes, and he comes back seeing. In each case, the faith that is asked for is not a feeling. It is not an emotion. It is not even a cognitive certainty. It is a motion, a willingness to move in the direction of the promised thing as though it is already there, before you can see it. For the man at Bethesda, that motion was the attempt to stand, and the attempt was answered. 38 years is a long time. It is long enough to make the waiting feel like the whole story, long enough that the world outside the colonnade of Bethesda might have faded into something almost theoretical, a place that exists in memory and in the conversation of visitors, but that the man himself had stopped expecting to inhabit again. Long enough that the question of whether he would ever walk freely through the streets of Jerusalem, feel the uneven stones under his own 2 feet, choose a direction and simply go there. That question had probably, at some point, stopped feeling like a question. It had settled into something more like an answer, the answer being no, the answer being not for me, the answer being, this is what my life is, and I have learned to live within it as best I can. And yet, on one particular festival afternoon, in a city full of thousands of pilgrims, in a pool complex full of people who had all also been told by the shape of their lives that the answer was no, one man turned his attention to the one who had been waiting the longest, the one who was, by the pool's own logic, the least likely to succeed, the one whose answer of no had been accumulating the longest. And he asked him a question, and the man answered honestly, and 3 words changed everything. There is no dramatic prayer recorded in this story, no long intercession, no laying on of hands, no elaborate ritual, no ceremony of any kind. Just 3 words, spoken with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he is saying and is not uncertain about the outcome. And immediately the man was well. Immediately. It is a word that the Gospels use with some frequency when describing what happens when Jesus speaks to a condition. Not eventually, not gradually, not after a period of rehabilitation, immediately. The 38 years responded to 3 words the way the morning responds to the rising of the sun. Not as something that has to be argued into happening, but as something that was always going to happen once the right thing arrived. Let us think about the moment the man walked out of the pool complex and into the streets of Jerusalem. The first steps, the first turns onto unfamiliar streets, or streets that had once been familiar 38 years ago, but now had to be relearned by a body doing something it had not done in decades. The first time he felt himself moving with the crowd instead of being left behind by it. The first time he made a choice, left or right, this street or that one, purely because he wanted to, without the choice being constrained by what his body could or could not manage. What do you do with yourself when the constraint you have organized your life around is suddenly gone? When the absence that has shaped your identity, your relationships, your daily rhythm, your interior landscape, when that absence is filled, there is joy in it certainly, but there is also something more complicated. The need to reconstruct a self that is no longer defined by what it cannot do. The need to discover what it wants. Now that want is no longer abstract. The need to learn for the first time, or for the first time in a very long time, who you are when you are not defined by your limitation. The man at Bethesda does not give us much to work with here. He goes to the temple. That much we know. And in the temple, Jesus finds him and speaks to him a second time. And after that, the text lets him go. We do not know what the rest of his life looked like. We do not know if he became a follower of Jesus or remained at a distance. We do not know if he told a story for the rest of his life or if he eventually stopped talking about it. The way people sometimes stop talking about the most important things that have happened to them because words have ceased to be adequate. We do not know if he ever went back to Bethesda, if he ever stood at the edge of that pool and looked into the still water and tried to understand what his life had been and what it now was. What we know is this: he walked out of that place carrying his mat, and he never lay down there again. The feast continued. The city continued. The thousands of pilgrims moved through the streets of Jerusalem, buying and selling and praying and arguing and eating and doing all the ordinary things that people do, even in holy cities on holy days. The Temple Mount rose above it all, white and gold in the afternoon light, its enormous platform visible from miles away. The priests moved through their duties. The teachers taught in the courts. The shofar called out its notes at the appointed hours. And somewhere in that city, a man walked who had not walked that morning. Walked with the slightly uncertain gait of someone rediscovering something. Not hesitant exactly, but attentive, conscious of each step in a way that a person who has walked their whole life is not. Each step still somewhat extraordinary to the person taking it, even as it looked to anyone watching like exactly the ordinary motion. It was a man walking through a city, nothing remarkable about it at all if you did not know. And the controversy the healing had generated moved on its own trajectory through the corridors of religious authority. Meetings, consultations, the slow accumulation of grievance against a name. Jesus, who healed on the Sabbath, who called God his Father, who moved through the crowd and spoke 3 words to a paralyzed man, and then disappeared before anyone could properly register what had happened. These two trajectories, the healed man walking freely through Jerusalem and the authorities hardening toward his healer, existed simultaneously on the same afternoon, in the same city, under the same festival sky. The miracle and the politics of the miracle ran parallel, not touching, each following its own logic toward its own conclusion. This is in miniature the shape of the entire story that John's Gospel is telling. The light enters the world and illuminates some things and casts shadows in others. The healing happens and produces gratitude in one place and opposition in another. The words of life are spoken, and some who hear them are freed, others are frightened, and others are simply enraged. The pool at Bethesda was a place where hope and despair existed side by side. The story of what happened there is a place where restoration and resistance exist side by side. It is not a clean story. It is not a story that resolves neatly into universal goodwill and collective celebration. It is a story about what happens when the extraordinary arrives in the middle of the ordinary, and different people, in encountering the same event, choose entirely different things to do with it. As this night settles in and the day's noise fades to silence around you, hold this image for a moment. The pool of Bethesda, 5 colonnades casting their shade over the stone, the water still and dark in the late afternoon, the people lying on their mats. Each one a world of waiting, of hope that has learned to be careful with itself, of bodies that have not done what they were built to do in a very long time, and one man among them, who has been there the longest, who has the least reason to expect that today will be different from all the previous days, who, when asked if he wants to be made well, does not answer with a yes, but with an explanation of everything that has prevented it, who is not, by any measure, the most promising candidate for a miracle, who has no particular faith on display, no practiced piety, no dramatic declaration, just a tired man giving an honest answer about why the pool has never worked for him, and 3 words: get up, pick up your mat, walk, and immediately he was made well. Whatever you are waiting beside tonight, whatever your version of the pool is, whatever the 38-year thing in your life looks like, the story of Bethesda does not promise you a timeline. It does not promise that the waiting will end tomorrow or that the pool you have been watching will finally stir for you. What it does offer is something perhaps more unsettling and more hopeful than that. The possibility that what you need is not at the pool at all, that it might arrive from a direction you are not watching, that it might speak to your condition directly without waiting for any of the circumstances to cooperate, that the question you might be asked before it happens is not whether you have enough faith or whether you have been patient enough or whether you have earned it, but simply whether you want it, whether you are ready to get up, whether you are willing to carry your mat into a life you do not yet know how to navigate, and that on some ordinary afternoon, in a city full of noise and crowds and all the usual complexity of being alive, the one who sees individuals even in the midst of many will find the one who has been waiting longest, will stop, will ask the question, and will speak 3 words that the body, against all the evidence of all the years, will know exactly how to answer. Rest now. Let the quietness of the evening hold you. Somewhere across the long history of this world, a man rolled up a mat he had not needed to carry for 38 years and walked out into the Jerusalem afternoon, and everything was different. Let that be the last thought your mind carries into sleep tonight. Everything was different, and immediately. Good night. There is one more thing worth considering before we let the story fully rest, and it has to do with the nature of the crowd at Bethesda. Not the individual man, but the collective. The many dozens, perhaps hundreds of people gathered beneath those 5 colonnades on the day Jesus walked through. People who were also blind, also lame, also paralyzed. People who had also been waiting, some of them for years. People who had also organized their lives around the possibility of the pool, and for whom, on that particular afternoon, nothing changed. No one else was healed. No other name was called. No other command was spoken to any other body in that place. This is one of the more quietly troubling aspects of the story, and it would be dishonest to glide past it without acknowledgement. It raises the question that suffering people have always raised when they encounter a story about healing. Why him? Why that one? What made this particular man the one whose waiting ended that afternoon, when the waiting of all the others continued? Was it something about the depth of his suffering? He had been there 38 years, but perhaps someone else had been there 40. Was it something about his faith? His answer to Jesus' question was not a declaration of faith, but an inventory of obstacles. He did not say, "I believe you can heal me." He said, "And I cannot get to the pool in time." Was it something about his character? We are given nothing to suggest it. The text does not answer this. John's gospel, in its characteristic way, simply does not go there. It tells us about the man who was healed, and does not stop to address the ones who were not. This silence has been felt by readers across 2,000 years, particularly by those who have sat beside their own versions of the pool and not been called, who have watched others receive what they were also waiting for, who have knelt in the same faith and spoken the same prayers, and received, for reasons they cannot fathom, a different answer. What theologians have offered across the centuries is not so much an answer as a reframing. And the healing at Bethesda is not presented as a template, not as a guarantee that all who wait long enough will be healed, or that all who answer honestly will be called to stand. It is presented as a sign, a single specific moment of the particular. This man, this afternoon, this pool, these three words, that points towards something larger than itself. Just as a single burning lamp in a dark room is not the source of all light in the world, but is evidence that light exists, and that the darkness is not the final condition of things. So one healing in one corner of Jerusalem on one Sabbath afternoon is not a promise that all the suffering of Bethesda ends that day. It is evidence of something. Evidence that the one who moves through the crowd sees individuals. Evidence that long suffering is not invisible. Evidence that three words, so spoken from the right source, are enough. This does not dissolve the difficulty. It does not make the silence of unanswered prayer comfortable to inhabit. But it does suggest that the story of Bethesda is not best read as a transaction. If you wait long enough, if you answer honestly, if the conditions are right, you will be healed. It is better read as a window, a brief, clear opening onto something that is always present but not always visible. The attention of the one who created the human body and has not stopped knowing what each one of them needs. Even when the pool is still, even when the years accumulate, even when the answer that arrives is not the one that was waited for. This is harder. It requires more of a person than a simple formula would. It asks you to hold both things at once. The reality of the one man who walked out of Bethesda carrying his mat, and the reality of everyone else who did not. To receive the first as genuine and good, without using it as evidence that suffering is simply a matter of waiting correctly. To grieve the second without concluding from it that no one is seen, that no attention is paid, that the pool will always be still. Faith in the biblical tradition has rarely been presented as a system that resolves cleanly. It has been presented as a way of moving through a world that contains both healing and continued suffering, both answered prayer and long silence, both the man who stood up and walked and the men and women who watched him go and remained where they were. It is a way of moving through all of that without collapsing into either easy certainty or permanent despair. The story of Bethesda does not offer easy certainty. What it offers is a specific, embodied, utterly concrete moment in which something that had been broken for 38 years was made whole in an instant. And it offers it not as proof, but as a gift to that man, to that afternoon, to everyone who has ever read about it since and recognized something of their own waiting in his. Jerusalem is still there. The city has been destroyed and rebuilt, occupied and liberated, and is today one of the most contested and watched and prayed over places on the surface of the earth. The Pool of Bethesda has been excavated by archaeologists and can be visited, or could be in eras of access, by pilgrims who want to stand in the place where the story happened. The stones are still there beneath the ground. The shape of the pool complex, the 5 colonnades, and the layout that matches what John's Gospel describes, it has been confirmed in the earth. The place was real. The pool was real. The 5 porticos cast real shade over real stone on real afternoons in the first century of the Common Era. And while we cannot know with archaeological certainty what happened beside that water on one Sabbath afternoon during one of the Jewish feast days, we know that the story of it has traveled through 2,000 years of human history and arrived here, tonight, in whatever room you are in, still capable of doing what stories do when they are alive, of making you feel, however briefly, that the distance between then and there, and now and here, is smaller than it usually seems. That the man on the mat and the listening, waiting part of you are not as far apart as the centuries between you would suggest. That the question, do you want to be made well, is still being asked, in forms you might not immediately recognize, and that the answer still matters, and that three words, or their equivalent in whatever language your particular life speaks, are still sufficient to change what 38 years have established as permanent. The night is quiet now. Your breath is slowing. Whatever you are carrying from this day, whatever weariness or worry or long accumulated weight, let it rest for a while. You have carried it faithfully. You do not have to carry it through the night as well. The pool is still, the city sleeps, and somewhere in the ancient record of human experience, a man stands up from a mat he has lain on for 38 years and discovers that his legs work perfectly. Let that be enough for now. Let that be the image that carries you over the threshold from waking into sleep. Rest well. You are seen.